The St. Martinsville Jane Doe, 1981. Identified as Michelle Oakes. It's believed that Michelle purposely stepped in front of traffic in 1981 in St. Martinsdale, Louisiana. Those investigating believed she wasn't from the United States and that she was rather from a European country, or was at least of French descent in Canada. None of this was correct, however. A trucker would come forward to say that he remembered encountering her at one point, seeing a story about the Jane Doe on the 10th anniversary of her being found. He came forward to say he remembered seeing her, and he remembered giving her a ride. It would later be confirmed that he had in fact given Michelle a ride. He had dropped her off in Louisiana, saying she accidentally left her purse behind, although no identification was mentioned as being inside. He said he bought her lunch and gave her $10. They did know she had at least one child, as she had a huge C-section scar. If they followed the lead of a child being left behind, it's not mentioned though. One amazing aspect of many of these stories is the way that the unidentified affect those around them. Some are ignored and forgotten, sometimes not even buried. But in other cases, people do all that they can to embrace somebody who deserves to be buried respectfully and remembered, even if they don't have her name. In the case of Michelle, 2 local residents named Lester Goudry and Sophie Cormier agreed to act as her mother and father, and that they did, looking after her grave for the following years until they themselves passed away. To them, she mattered. Residents also donated funds for a funeral, a plot, her burial, and a marker. It turns out that Michelle was 26 when she passed away. All her daughter knew was one day her mom didn't come home. It turns out that Michelle was in fact from the U.S. She was a Maine native who struggled a lot with how she controlled her life, moving from Maine to Louisiana, her small daughter in tow. But this, unfortunately, just isolated the young daughter, putting her in risky situations even after her mother disappeared, situations that young girl still remembers to this day. Unfortunately, only one person appeared to know at the time that Michelle was missing, and that person was Michelle's friend. While Michelle's friend raised Angie, it appears she didn't report the mother missing. There's no indication of just how well she was taken care of. Perhaps she didn't want the young girl taken from her. But based on Michelle's life, it's possible it wasn't good. It appears the friend left behind did the best she could, continuing to raise Angie until a few years later, a state agency was alerted to the case of the young woman. However this happened, they did eventually send her back to her aunt and uncle in Maine. It's one of those things that isn't often covered in the press, though I try to include it when I can. The kids left behind and what happened to them matters. And it's great to be able to say that Angie said she had a great life, and her home with her aunt and uncle was filled with love. She went on to marry and have kids of her own, and she's now a grandmother herself. But she says she has an underlying need to know what happened to her mom. While notifications were sent out to multiple states at the time, she went unidentified. It took 40 years, but a recreation made of Michelle finally gave her name back, and this is because her daughter kept looking. Her daughter eventually identified the picture from 1,700 miles away. And with this, Michelle finally had her name, and most especially her daughter Angie finally knew her mother's fate.
But the question for Angie still lingered. What happened to my mom? Meanwhile, officials in Louisiana were working to find the identity of Jane Doe. After DNA work and a facial reconstruction process, the sheriff's office in Louisiana released this photo 5 years ago.
I knew it was her. I knew instantly that I said, that's my mom.
This past February, DNA tests were done to confirm that Jane Doe was Angie's mom.
She said that after the identification, there was a huge sigh of relief, and she was able to hang up the phone, finally knowing her seemingly endless journey was over. Michelle went unidentified for 40 years. Dorothy Harrison of Wichita, Kansas. Dorothy was last seen about 5 p.m. on July 25, 1984. when she left her home in Wichita, Kansas. One of her siblings saw her get into a vehicle that was described as big, tan, and long. She got into the front seat with a white female and a black female. Both were older than Dorothy, which wasn't hard to do since Dorothy was only 16. Shortly after she disappeared, she was reported missing by her family. The problem being Dorothy was a habitual runaway, and so no one ever really expected this to be any different from the other times. Dorothy would leave, be gone for a few weeks, and then her family would find her back home. Each time this happened, she stayed near home in Kansas. A month later, in August of 1984, Dorothy called home, telling her family she was in Los Angeles. The following month, September of 1984, she called again, and this time she was located in El Paso, Texas. On this occasion, she told her family that she'd had enough, and she was coming home. This was the last time anyone heard from her. Even more complicated, trying to figure out where she may have disappeared from. She could have been anywhere between a home and El Paso, and this led to 37 years of pain and questions. The authorities believe Dorothy's life was taken between September 10, 1984 and January 10, 1985. It's highly likely because of her past behavior that she was heading home like she had told her parents. Dorothy was found on a road leading to Hatch, New Mexico, in March of 1985 by hunters who happened to find her scattered remains, many of which were located beneath black plastic. Her life had been taken 3 to 6 months prior. It was a remote area of desert, though both hunters and ranchers were known to pass randomly through there quite often. Decade after decade, they would compare her DNA to other missing women, ruling out 33 other people as being this Jane Doe. They knew she had brown hair, and she'd suffered a healed injury to the right side of her nose. She also had a small scar on her mouth. It was her DNA in the end that would solve the mystery, discovering she was in fact Dorothy Harrison of Wichita, Kansas. They have no idea who took her life, and it's extremely important anyone who encountered her at this time come forward to relay her movements. Please call the number on your screen or submit the information anonymously through Crime Stoppers. Her family released this statement. Dorothy was a typical teenager. She was only 16 when this horrific crime happened. Like most teens, she was sometimes unhappy at home and easily influenced. She left home with some people she thought were her friends, and we never saw her again. The news of her death is devastating. And even though this crime happened over 30 years ago, to our family, it's new and extremely difficult information to process. We have so many unanswered questions and are hopeful we'll be able to provide some of those answers. Dorothy Harrison went unidentified for 16 years. The Summerton Man, identified as Carl Charles Webb. There's so many pieces to this story that it turned out not only to be probably the most famous case in Australia, but one of the most famous cases in the whole world. It's captivated those of us in the U.S. and other countries for a long time, since 1948. However, more and more has come out about Carl. I think it's important for me to explain also that while the professor announced that he'd gotten DNA off of the death mask and figured out who in fact the Summerton Man was, the police seem reluctant to immediately agree that he was correct. It shows in many places that it's pending identification. That may change by the time this video comes out, but at this point, it's not absolutely concrete. I'll be interested to see how they go ahead to agree that they've got the right identification. In the case of John Clinton Doe, they exhumed a parent, so it's possible they may try to look for a direct relative of his to prove concretely that he was, in fact, Carl Webb. So first, right now, I'll play out the details of the original case, and then I'll explain what we know so far. The Summerton Man died alone on Somerton Park Beach in Adelaide, South Australia in 1948. But who he was has always remained a mystery. Even though it's been more than 70 years, People haven't stopped trying to solve this case. He was found looking dapper in a brown suit, with a half-smoked cigarette resting on his collar. When he was last exhumed in hopes of identifying him, the police made this statement: "It's important for everybody to remember the Summerton Man is not just a curiosity or a mystery to be solved. It might be somebody's father, son, perhaps grandfather, uncle, or brother. And that's why we're doing this, to try to identify him." Police are hoping that DNA will solve this in the end. Summerton Man was found on his back in the sand, shoulders propped up against the seawall. That he was dressed so well in a suit and newly polished shoes was just more of a mystery. 2 apprentice jockeys were in the area and they saw him lying there the night before. But when they went to investigate, they said his arm moved, so they moved on thinking he was fine. It was odd in part too, because if he chose to go somewhere to die, it was a weird place to do it. It was pretty public and had people often milling around the area. The examination of his remains raised more questions than it answered. All of the labels on his clothing had been removed, and he wasn't carrying any ID. They couldn't identify the cause of death, but it was considered to be unnatural. There's a theory he consumed some sort of rare poison that was able to disappear without a trace, leading to heart failure. He's described as being a well-built man, 40 to 50, 5'11", with gray blue eyes and brown hair that had begun to gray at the sides. Even his toenails were well-groomed. He was clearly not a homeless man, and for this reason, police believed someone would miss him and he'd be identified, but that just didn't happen. One weird aspect they found, however, is that his feet were pointed as if he had been in the habit of wearing high-heeled, pointed shoes. His calves were muscled also in a way that supports that theory. There were also suggestions that he could be a dancer. Others insisted he was a sailor or a spy. Some believed him to possibly be British. His clothes appeared to have come from America, so it's possible he was well-traveled. Many people over the years have called in tips, but all have led to dead ends. He had purchased a train ticket to Henley Beach, near Somerton Beach, but he didn't use it for some reason. Instead, he made his way to the beach by bus. They know his suitcase was found at the train station, and it contained some distinctive orange thread that had been used to repair the suit panels he was wearing, so they're positive it's his case. Nothing in the bag pointed to his name. One strange clue was in a hidden pocket inside of his suit, and inside was a rolled-up paper with the words, "Tamam Shud," which means the end or finished in Persian. It had been ripped from a book, and it was about a poem, about how we are on the earth to enjoy it. And when we are done, it's time to pass on with no regrets. The book it came from was discarded in a random car and was turned in by the man who found it. The book was seen as the best clue, and inside it was a phone number for a woman who lived nearby. When the police found her and questioned her, they described her as acting suspiciously. She reacted to the photo of the Summerton Man, but she claimed not to know him. The police, for years, attempted to question her, but she always refused. Eventually, an armchair detective uncovered her name, but by then Jessica Ellen Thompson had passed away in 2007, never disclosing the identity of the man or how she knew him. His post-mortem photos can be found online if searched. We don't show those on this channel, but I always tell you if they're there. It does appear they are trying to use DNA to find out who he was. He was exhumed on May 19, 2021. The Summerton Man was likely born in the late 1800s and has gone unidentified for 73 years.
Slowly, more and more details have come out, more than I actually suspected was even possible. And you'll see why it's likely the professor was correct. Many specific aspects have been explained. Carl Webb sometimes went by the name of Charles, but in this case I'm just going to refer to him as Carl since it's his given name. In this case, it's pretty original because Carl passed away 70 years ago, so all that knew him are long gone too. Most of what's coming out now comes from the careful work of a man named Derek Abbott. He's a researcher at a college, and he tried for many, many years to identify the Summerton Man. The weird thing about it, too, is he somehow was given access to the death mask, which is the plaster mask that they used to rebuild what he looked like in the recreations. Reportedly, the authorities in Australia were using genetic genealogy to find his name. But then there was a large gap in time and nothing was announced. It appears their quest didn't end with his name, but instead it was this researcher from Adelaide University who came into contact with the death mask, and he used that to build his own recreation. And with that access to the death mask came the details that people on multiple continents have been waiting to know. Who exactly was the Summerton Man? We all came to care about the strange man who took his own life, included the coded note in his pocket, and the strange book of Persian poems, and he was smartly dressed in a double-breasted suit. In addition, he had an unused ticket to Henley Beach, so why? Why did he do this? The phone number he had led to Jessica Ellen Thompson. That's also fascinating, especially since she refused to say if she knew him. It was very odd that she just flat out refused to help or answer questions. As a result, his story remained absolutely compelling. For many years, people were convinced he was a Cold War-era spy. But it turns out he wasn't. Carl was the youngest of 6 kids born to a family in 1905 in Australia, although his family itself had immigrated a few years before from Hamburg, Germany. His father married a woman named Eliza in 1892, and they opened a bakery in Springvale, Victoria. They were a loving family, and Carl, as well as his 3 brothers and 2 sisters, grew up appreciating hard work, but also with a lot of love. His sister Doris is seen here. His brother Roy, pictured here, passed away 5 years before Carl took his life on Somerton Beach. His brother Roy was killed in action during World War II in 1943. Authorities knew that the fancy suit Carl was wearing had been purchased in the U.S., and this fact would further contribute to the allure of a bigger story. It turned out that the clothing likely belonged to his brother-in-law. Charles had a sister named Frida, who was married to Thomas Gerald Keene. This explains why the name Keene was on some of his possessions. Frida and Thomas had a son who was also serving in World War II. He too died in battle in 1943, as did their brother Roy. John Keene had apparently resided in the U.S. at one time, and in his possession were things like U.S. maps, coins, and clothing. It's believed that it's likely the suit that Carl took his life in that belonged to John. In fact, with Carl's possessions, the authorities noted a laundry bag with the last name of Keene, as did a singlet, which those of us in the U.S. might not recognize as a shirt with no sleeves. Carl also had with him a tie that said T. Keene. A link to the complete list of possessions found with the Summerton Man can be found in the description below. While there aren't any photographs further proving Carl was a Summerton Man, it's noted how similar he looks to his brother Roy, especially in the photo with the side view. After his brother's death and as time went on, Carl began to suffer from depression. A lot of terrible things had happened pretty close together. In 1939, Carl lost his father. Then, in 1943, both his brother and his nephew were killed in war. Then, in 1941, his mother passed away. Later that same year, Carl married for the first time to a woman named Dorothy, and she is identified as working as a foot specialist. It was a lot to go through for Carl, and he was obviously an intelligent guy. At the time of his death, he was 43, and he'd been working as an electrical engineer and an instrument maker, living in Footscray, which is located in Melbourne, Australia. It's hard to believe no one recognized his death photos, especially since there was a lot of publicity. But of course, he was 728 kilometers from home, which is about 450 miles. Letters from around that time indicate that Carl underwent a pretty severe personality change. According to letters written by his wife, Carl liked to play cards, but if he lost, he became sullen and angry. He began going to bed at 7 p.m. nightly. Sometimes when his wife Dorothy spoke to him, he would refuse to reply at all. She would go on to say that he liked to live a quiet life. He enjoyed both writing and reading poetry. He also enjoyed going and betting on horse races. So while we know now he wasn't some mysterious Cold War spy, there's still no known explanation for the phone number found with him. When the police went to question her, she had some strange reactions to his photo, and it was this that convinced them that she did know Carl, although she claimed not to know him. Whether they'd been having a relationship and the fact that he was married had something to do with her not saying it could be, but there's no way to know. Too many years have passed. We know her name was Jessica Ellen Thompson, but she died before the researcher found her name. It was something that had been kept under wraps until then. It's sad to think that one person might have been able to identify him while he still had a wife and siblings left behind. 3 years after his death, Dorothy Webb filed for a divorce. In 1951, she placed an ad in the local Melbourne newspaper under a category named Missing Friends. This was legally required if she was going to be able to obtain a divorce. And in fact, it appears that his family just believed Carl was missing. They didn't believe that he had taken his life. Dorothy's petition for divorce was finalized in 1952 on the grounds that he had abandoned her. And I guess, in a way, he had. The years wound on, and no one knew what happened to Carl, at least not for 73 years. Carl Webb went unidentified for 73 years. The Pearl Harbor John Doe, identified as Claude Ralph Garcia. Claude Garcia was a United States Navy sailor who was on the USS West Virginia when Japanese forces attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. I've not been covering the DNA war identifications that have been happening as of late, but the truth is that Othram has identified quite a few of these brave men who fought for our country. And I wanted to take a moment to thank this man and his family for the sacrifice that they made for our country. The attack on Pearl Harbor took the lives of 2,403 people. Most of them were U.S. personnel, but of those, 68 were civilians. Each life lost has a ripple effect on their own family members, changing the course of the lives of so many thousand people, beyond just those specific lives cut short. People that without this would have had kids and lived happy lives. But the truth is, it's an important part of our history, and without people being willing to stand up and protect our country, and the same with everyone in all the other countries, we would all just be at the mercy of invading forces. On that day, at 7:48 a.m. on December 7, 1941, the Imperial Japanese Navy Air Force conducted a surprise military strike against the United States at the naval base in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. This was an unprecedented attack, and it would serve as the beginning of the U.S.'s involvement in World War II. The USS West Virginia, where Claude was located, was hit with torpedoes, but thanks to the crew's counter-flooding measures, the ship came to a final rest on the shallow harbor floor, and it did not capsize. Overall, 106 men and women, including Claude, were on the U.S. West Virginia. It was that surprise attack that led U.S. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt to declare on December 7, 1941, a date that will live in infamy. The following day, the U.S. Congress declared war on Japan, which led to the United States' formal entry into World War II. Claude would eventually be awarded the Purple Heart, and his name was featured in Court 3 of the Courts of the Missing of the Honolulu Memorial in Hawaii. Between December 8, 1941 and November 24, 1942, Navy personnel recovered his remains and that of other U.S. West Virginia personnel. I'd love to know what people think. In a case like this, we knew his remains were there and that he perished. Is it invasive to continue picking apart remains and testing them to try to offer burial under their name and put a final period in the story of the lives of Claude and those like him? Or is it more respectful, after 81 years, to just let him rest? After all, those who knew Claude are gone too. No matter what anyone feels about war, men and women before them and again long after them made a choice to serve their country, and they definitely deserve respect, although I suppose how one offers that respect is debatable. In September 1947, the American Graves Registration Service was tasked with identifying members from the Pacific. They managed to identify many of those men and women back then. But in this case, there were still 25 USS West Virginia personnel that had gone unaccounted for, and they did know that Claude was one of them. Sadly, at the time, they had to rule that Claude and the rest of the men that were with him were unidentifiable and unrecoverable. As a result, they buried 38 sets of possible remains in 35 plots at the National Memorial Cemetery. Because there were more remains than people left unidentified on the ship, it was made even more confusing. It's believed that perhaps some of the men found actually came from other ships. And in a case like that, maybe it does make sense to keep digging and try to identify all that were left in those graves. In 2017, the Defense of Prisoners of War, or Men Missing in Action, accounting agency began the USS West Virginia project, which led to exhuming those 38 sets of remains, and they are still working on them. Claude Ralph Garcia is the first resident of Ventura, California, killed in this war. He went unidentified for nearly 81 years. His identification was announced on July 20th, 2022. Claude was just 25 when his life was taken. The Lost Creek John Doe, identified as Gregory Woodford. Gregory disappeared in the middle of June 2019, and there isn't a lot about him that's been released, but he was just 30 years old when he disappeared. He was a U.S. Navy veteran who had been living in Colorado Springs. A man was found a year later in June of 2020. He was in the Lost Creek Wilderness area off a trail in Lake George, Colorado. His cause of death wasn't released, but it's mentioned in some of the press releases that he took his own life. And there is a note that a 12-gauge shotgun was found with him, along with hiking poles, a backpack, and some other items, but no ID. They couldn't do a dental identification because of damage to his skull. The authorities had a hard time identifying him, and it was further complicated by the fact that he wasn't reported missing. It appears that Gregory originally came from Roanoke, Virginia, but he'd been living in Colorado, which probably further complicated things. It would take DNA to identify Gregory Woodford. His mother wrote a letter to those who fought hard to identify the son she loved, and it was read at the press conference, saying, Greg, who was also named Mario when he served in the Navy, was an extraordinary son and human being. He was also such an intelligent, caring, kind, generous, selfless man. Greg was drawn to Colorado due to his exquisite beauty and his inherent love for nature and animals, especially dogs, and his deep passion for the wolf sanctuary. Greg was dearly loved by many people whose lives he touched, and he will forever be missed. Words cannot sufficiently express my gratitude and appreciation, especially to Dave, who is the coroner, and also to the genealogist and anyone involved in all the time and effort and resources used to identify my son. You have my deepest, heartfelt thanks for not giving up. Thank you so much. After reading the letter to media members at a June 13th press conference in Fairplay, Colorado, the coroner paused before stating, This is the reason I do this, and this is why it's so important to obtain positive identification in these types of situations. Gregory Allen Woodford was missing from his family for 3 years. He went unidentified as a Doe for 2. Riverside Jane Doe, 1991, identified as Kathryn Coffey. It appears no recreation was ever done in this case. We know she was found in the open desert in the thermal area of the Coachella Valley in 1991, near a freeway ramp. They estimated she'd been there for quite a while. All they ever really reported was that foul play was suspected and that she had a small frame. They also knew she had reddish-brown hair with some gray. It's just too little to go on. And not to mention, without a recreation, the odds of identifying her were even smaller. It's also unsettling how many times I've had to mention freeways and on and off ramps here. Thankfully, DNA Solves, which is part of Othram Labs, partnered with the district attorney's office to use genome sequencing and solve this case. They found genetic relatives through forensic genealogy, leading to Kathryn's sister, eventually giving her name back on August 23, 2022. We now know that Kathryn was born in 1954, and she was last seen between 1989 and 1990. This means her age was 36 to 37 at the time. They believe she was living in Baldwin Park, California, but she was last sighted in the Indio area of California. While Baldwin Park is farther away from where she was found, the place she was last seen isn't. Indio and the Thermal Valley aren't very far away at all. Thermal Valley is an unincorporated area that is part of the Coachella Valley. Kathryn graduated from Scripps College in the mid-1970s with a degree in English literature. It appears she wasn't in close contact with her family at the time, and that's likely why she wasn't reported missing. That's also why it's so important for anyone who knows what she was up to at the time to come forward. I've provided the phone number for Valley Crime Stoppers. You can leave a tip without ever giving your name. They just need to have a lead to allow them to focus on to begin to get a picture of what might have happened to Kathryn. Kathryn Coffey went unidentified for 31 years. The Grainger County Jane Doe, identified as Brenda Clark. In this case, a young woman was found near the county line in Grainger County, Tennessee. The sheriff's office was called to assist in investigating the discovery that was made by hunters in a wooded area near Dale Road in the Powder Springs section of Grainger County on September 29, 1996. Unbeknownst to the sheriff's department, a young woman went missing that same year from Knoxville, Tennessee. Despite it being close to where the Jane Doe was found, they didn't match the missing person to the homicide. While they never disclosed her cause of death, they did say, based on evidence at the scene, that it wasn't natural. They believe she was 30 to 40 years old. As I've mentioned before, CODIS is the first place authorities check for a match. And in this case, in 2018, 22 years after she was found, they obtained a viable sample of her DNA through the University of North Texas Center for Identification. This university has been important in a number of Jane and John Doe cases. They submitted the results to CODIS, and while usually the DNA sits and waits for a hit, it wasn't the case here. There was an exact match to a still living woman. It's unclear why it took so long, as they note it was matched in 2018, but it wasn't until August 13, 2022, that her identity was announced. It would eventually be announced that the reason there was a DNA match to a living person, she has an identical twin sister, and her sister's DNA was in the system. It's possible they had trouble locating her, and that's why it took so long for it to be announced. Or perhaps they thought there was some sort of a mistake. Brenda's sister would eventually say Brenda disappeared in 1996 at the age of 38. Unfortunately, beyond the point that they know she has an identical twin, there was no other information released. So it's important that anyone who knew Brenda at that time, you might have information that's important. Please call the number on the screen. They need to speak to anyone who might be able to provide information on what was going on in her life at the time, so they can investigate and find the person responsible. Brenda Clark went unidentified for 25 years. The False Bay, Australia, John Doe, identified as Mario Della Torre. In this case, Mr. Mario Della Torre was an Italian immigrant who had arrived in Australia in the late 1930s, and he went by the name of Della. He was 54 when he disappeared. He had no children of his own, but he was close to his parents and his brother. And he was considered a good man who was loved by those around him. He started experiencing some troubles in his life, and he was described as having some pretty severe depression. He had tried to be proactive, and he was prescribed an antidepressant, but it hadn't been working, at least not yet. Then suddenly he disappeared in October of 1976. His family didn't hold out a lot of hope that he was still alive. He was not someone who would walk away from his life to just start again somewhere else. So there wasn't really any strong belief that he had survived. His family reached out to the media, begging them to help, but no leads were discovered. He was just missing.
Then, on April 21st, 1977, Della's remains would wash up on the beach near False Bay. False Bay is pretty close to where he had lived, and they always suspected that the remains belonged to the missing man. After an inquest in 1979, the current coroner released a statement saying he could not state with any certainty that they had found Della Torre. A cold case unit more recently began examining the remains that were found so long ago. They had been set aside, of course, in 1977 because DNA wasn't even an option. The constable didn't give up, though, and he referred the case to the National DNA Program, which offered more options than were currently available to use in South Australia. This came with an additional challenge. Della, like so many people of that time, had had all of his teeth pulled in favor of false teeth, so there was no teeth to obtain DNA from. They also couldn't compare any dental films. In addition to this challenge, not having any children made it harder to compare the DNA. However, they did have a strong belief that those bones belonged to Della, and he did still have a living brother, as well as a niece named Mercedes, who very much wanted to know what happened to her uncle. Not only were they successful in extracting DNA from those bones, they had had family DNA to compare it to, and now, finally, it came time to find out. This made those involved very hopeful so they could solve the mystery of who the man was that they discovered on that beach so long ago. While not as famous as the Summerton Man, the remains that were found were pretty important to many people who lived in Australia. Australia has a lot less unidentified Jane and John Doe cases, but this makes the suspense and the pressure to close the case all that much greater. The senior constable was clear that this case mattered, and that the National DNA Program offers a unique opportunity for the department to have new technology assist. And while so much hinged on the hope of a match, there was a backup plan to use the DNA to search sites like GEDmatch, if this wasn't successful. However, it was. Mr. Mario Della Torre once again had his name. He went unidentified for 40 years. The Tucson John Doe, February 2019. Identified as Tommy Gale Poole, Jr. Tommy was found on February 26, 2019, in Tucson, Arizona, in an area where transient individuals often camped. It appears his cause of death was likely natural. They estimated him to be between 32 and 50, but this would turn out to be inaccurate. Otherwise, all they really knew was that he had gray hair, brown eyes, and a porcelain crown replacement for an upper tooth. The DNA Doe Project took this case, releasing Tommy's identity in August of 2022. They got lucky right away. They found 2 close relatives as far as DNA matches relating to Tommy. It would turn out both of those matches were his second cousins, and they knew what member of their family was missing. It took less than 18 hours to solve this case and find his identity, which is extremely fast. Sometimes it can take months, and other times they wait years because they have to wait for more uploads to GEDmatch. It was with this that they learned the Tucson John Doe is in fact Tommy Poole, Jr. from Virginia. We now know he was 61 years old at the time. He'd been living very close to where he was found, less than 2 miles away in a Tucson residence. In 2017, however, he was evicted and he would end up in an encampment where he was found. The thing that is so profoundly sad is that the only photo available of Tommy appears to be from an arrest of some kind, which isn't documented. And for that reason, it's my semi-educated guess, based on what I've seen in cases so far, is that it was most likely some kind of petty crime, like public vagrancy. His remains have not been claimed, and they are waiting for family members to take responsibility. This man desperately needs someone to come forward. If you know somebody in Tommy's family that's missing him, please contact the authorities at the number given. Tommy Gale Poole, Jr. went unidentified for 3 years.
The Tucson parking lot John Doe, 2019. Identified as James Mark Chaparro. Mark was found near a shopping center parking lot in Tucson, Arizona, around December of 2019. They estimated him to be 40 to 65, with the prevailing theory of him going to the store and never coming home, and that no one reported him missing. It's not clear what his living situation was, but his family for some reason believed he'd been living in China, which is why no one reported him missing. It's possible he may have been homeless. They did find proof that he'd been evicted from a home in Tucson, Arizona, shortly before he was found. What's sad is, in this group of cases, I now have 2 Tucson John Does found 6 months apart, who were both evicted from homes. The DNA Doe Project stepped in for both cases, identifying the 2 men in August of 2022. James went unidentified for 3 years. Thank you, everybody, for watching and listening. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't yet. Take care of yourselves and each other.